His name is synonymous with the ongoing war in Gaza and with the vicious attack on October the 7th, 2023, which sparked it. Although he is not the outright leader of the Islamic resistance movement, better known as Hamas, it is Yahya Hassan Sinwar who has directed Hamas's operations on the ground in the Gaza Strip for the better part of a decade. It's also he who is held by Israel as the chief strategist behind the attack, which saw thousands of the group's fighters stream into Israel, leaving a brutal aftermath in its wake. So, today, we thought we'd take a look at the life of Yahya Sinwar and the development of the organization closely intertwined with his fate, in an attempt to discern just how things got to where they are today. Yahya Sinwar is from Khan Yunis, the second city of the Gaza Strip, located only a few kilometers from both the Mediterranean coast and the border with Egypt. Sinwar's family originated from the city of Ashkelon and were displaced by the intercommunal fighting during the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. During his formative years, in the 1970s, conflict raged between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, alongside militant groups such as Black September, with multiple bloody massacres taking place in Israel and abroad. The cause of Palestinian statehood, achieved through militant means, was at the time pursued mostly by Arab nationalist organizations who were ideologically secular. But as Sinwar reached adulthood, a new form of Palestinian militancy was beginning to emerge in the form of Sunni Islamist jihadism, towards which some Palestinians began to turn to take the mantle of their struggle. As a young man, Sinwar himself had turned toward Islamism and led an organization called Al-Majid, Arabic for the Glory, in the mid-1980s, which merged into Hamas when the latter formed in 1987. Over the next few years, Hamas followed through on its commitment to violence in the name of Palestinian liberation through a bombing campaign against Israeli targets. The bombings, which occurred against the backdrop of the First Intifada, helped bring the organization to public attention, and with it, its leaders and members were also cast into the spotlight. For his part, Sinwar had thrown himself into the organization with aplomb, quickly becoming a key and ruthless member of its security apparatus and dishing out vicious punishments against suspected collaborators with Israel. In 1989, he was convicted by an Israeli court of the murder of 2 Israeli soldiers and 4 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. During the course of his trial, Sinwar admitted to brutal retributions carried out against suspected collaborators. In one case, he claimed to have lured a man accused of collaboration to a graveyard in Khan Yunis, where the man was bundled into a coffin before Sinwar strangled him to death using a keffiyeh, the traditional headdress worn by Palestinians. Sinwar was convicted of those 4 murders and complicity in a total of 12. He was handed 4 consecutive life sentences, and the then 27-year-old began his term in a high-security prison near the southern Israeli city of Beersheba without any conceivable prospect of release on the horizon. At least for now, his part in the conflict seemed to be done. So, now, a little bit about Hamas. Hamas was founded in 1987 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi. Hamas is an acronym for the longer title Islamic Resistance Movement, and the word Hamas also translates to the Arabic word for zeal. Its origins lie with the Sunni Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, to which both Yassin and al-Rantisi had belonged while studying in Egypt, and the second article of the 1988 Covenant, or Charter, actually identified it as the Brotherhood's chapter in Gaza. Yassin had been heavily inspired by the success of the Iranian Revolution 10 years before, when a relatively modern state returned to a conservative theocracy through a mass uprising which overthrew its monarch, Reza Shah. Yassin founded Hamas with such mobilization in mind, although initially he gained local renown for a string of civil projects benefiting the people of Gaza. This included the establishment of an Islamic center, which offered religious, social, cultural, health, and sporting services, and he also contributed to the founding of the Islamic University of Gaza in 1978. Yassin was an influential imam and preacher, and his sermons contributed to a rise in religious devotion among the people of Gaza. He was also active in collecting donations and in helping the families of killed Palestinian militants and prisoners. But Yassin's community-building activities contrasted starkly with his bloodthirsty plans for Israel. He delivered bellicose sermons from his mosque in the Shati refuge camp in Gaza, calling for resistance against occupation, and his rhetoric saw an uptick in actions targeting Israeli soldiers. In 1989, he was arrested by Israel and convicted of ordering the deaths of suspected collaborators and was handed a life term in an Israeli prison. In fact, the objectives of Hamas itself were quite clear to those who looked closely enough. The text of the 1988 Charter made regular reference to jihadist dogma and the supremacy of Islam. Its 27th article dismissed the Palestine Liberation Organization, claiming it could not successfully represent the struggle of the Palestinian people while retaining a secular identity. It was also full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and spoke of Hamas's, quote, struggle against the Jews, while further claiming that Israel would continue to exist only until Islam would, quote, obliterate it. Regarding social policy, Hamas's positions closely resembled those of other hardline conservative religious factions in other parts of the Middle East and Asia. From 1987 to 1991, it campaigned to make wearing of the hijab mandatory, as had become the case in Iran, resulting in the verbal harassment of women who chose not to do so. It also promoted polygamy and the segregation of men and women in many areas of public life, alongside a domestic role for women in the household. By 1991, Hamas had merged its militant factions to form the notorious Is al-Din al-Qassam brigades, which became its military wing and would take the mantle for most of the bombing campaigns it carried out throughout the following decades. The following year, as the First Intifada raged, Israel attempted to stifle Hamas by rounding up over 400 of its leading members and deporting them to Lebanon. This solution, however, turned out to be wildly miscalculated, not only because it received instant condemnation from the international community due to its pseudo-legal nature, and because some of those deported were found not to be actually members of Hamas at all, but also because of the strategic links that would be created in Lebanon. You see, southern Lebanon, which was at that time under Israeli occupation, was and remains a heartland for the Shia Islamist organization Hezbollah, which Hamas's leadership soon established ties with. Hezbollah, allied with Iran, which was fresh off the success of the Islamic Revolution, passed on to Hamas various tactics in urban warfare, guerrilla tactics, and above all, suicide bombing, which would see frequent use before and during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. As a side note, a common and rather fanciful allegation made against Israel is that it actually helped create Hamas for one reason or another. While this claim is inaccurate, it most likely stems from this decision to send the Hamas leaders to Lebanon, where they would inadvertently be exposed to like-minded opponents of Israel. Among the Hamas figures who did so was Ismail Haniyeh, the future leader of the organization who would ultimately be assassinated by Israel in 2024. Israel made a series of similar tactical blunders during the mid-90s. In 1996, a targeted explosion killed Yahya Sinwar, Hamas's principal bomb maker, and the man responsible for most of the explosive attacks by Hamas in the previous year. Although it was a significant scalp, the assassination occurred only shortly after Hamas had promised the PLO to scale back their bombing operations, something which they had largely held to throughout the previous year. The assassination sparked not only an immediate return to such tactics, but further boosted Hamas's popularity among Palestinians in Gaza, as an estimated 100,000 people lined the streets for the funeral of Ayash. And the following year, Israel brought more negative attention upon itself with a botched assassination attempt on then Hamas leader Khaled Mashal in Jordan. Mashal, who'd recently been elected leader of Hamas in place of the imprisoned Ahmed Yassin, was doused with a fast-acting poison as he left Hamas's offices in Amman by two undercover Israeli agents. The attack left him in a coma, but the agents were quickly arrested by Jordanian authorities, and Israel found itself under pressure to provide an antidote as Jordan threatened to withdraw from the 1994 Oslo Accords if Mashal were to die. With peace on the line, Israel turned over the antidote and was forced to strike a deal with Jordan, which saw Ahmed Yassin released from imprisonment and returned to Gaza. Unsurprisingly, both events played into the hands of Hamas, who became emboldened enough to begin targeting Israelis indiscriminately. The organization announced that it now considered all Israeli targets to be legitimate, having previously targeted mostly soldiers and military installations. It soon began to target the Israeli public with its bomb attacks, carrying these out at bus stops and on public transport, and eventually in places like shopping malls and nightclubs. The Second Intifada began in the year 2000, and Hamas attacks resulted in over 1,000 Israeli deaths over 5 years, with most of these being civilians. This represented a significantly higher death toll than Israel had suffered in the First Intifada. And faced with this onslaught, Israel took the decision to assassinate Hamas's founder, Ahmed Yassin, which it did by a drone strike in March 2004. Now, here again, the timing of Israel's strike was strategically questionable. While the logic of targeting the man undeniably behind much of Hamas's wanton attacks was understandable, the timing and execution of the strike led to a lot of criticism. The drone attack which killed Yassin also killed some of his entourage and 9 civilian bystanders. This, combined with the targeted killing of a wheelchair-bound man in frail health, led to condemnation of Israel abroad. Yassin was quadriplegic, having been paralyzed at the age of 12 in a freak sporting accident. He was therefore unable to move around independently, and despite his central role in the planning of attacks against Israel, Yassin was now 67, almost blind and deaf, and in generally poor health. But the killing came at a strange time for another reason. Only 2 months before his assassination, Yassin had indicated a willingness to end the bombing in exchange for the recognition of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, seemingly foregoing the demand for the right of return of displaced Palestinians to their former villages in Israel, one of the Palestinians' central demands. Whether this was a genuine offer or not, it did represent a significant departure from the uncompromising positions of Hamas until then. Killing Yassin only a few weeks after this declaration was heavily criticized by some advocates for peace. But Israel, in spite of the criticism, doubled down on its strategy by eliminating the other founder of Hamas, Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi, in a similar strike only 3 weeks later. The funerals of both men were attended by thousands, and Hamas vowed revenge. The following year, 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon took another decision which would have significant consequences for all that was to follow. As the Second Intifada drew to an end, the decision was announced by Israel to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza and close all existing Jewish settlements there, as well as to relocate the roughly 9,000 settlers elsewhere. Strategically, this was yet another questionable move. Even if removing the controversial settlements was morally and legally justified, from a political perspective, especially for Israel, it was difficult to look at it as anything but a sort of debacle. The withdrawal came at a time when Israeli public anger from the many years of suicide bombings was still very high, and to withdraw from Gaza was seen by many Israelis as a capitulation to the Palestinians, generating massive dissatisfaction domestically. But the decision also compromised the Palestinian Authority, led by Yasser Arafat, which was jointly responsible for administering Gaza as per the terms of the Oslo Accords. The authority was not consulted or informed about the Israeli withdrawal ahead of time and played no role in the sudden transition from a tightly controlled security environment into a sort of vacuum which whoever held the public's attention could now fill. And keep in mind, this event closely followed the many years of anger which had marked the Second Intifada, as well as the deaths of thousands of Palestinians during its course. The people of Gaza had to contend with extreme economic isolation, power shortages, high unemployment, and lawlessness. Moreover, Israel had just killed Ahmed Yassin and Ahmed Aziz al-Rantisi, both of whom were held in very high esteem in Gaza. This was especially true in the case of Yassin, an almost mythicized figure whose charitable exploits had seen him ranked as the second most popular Palestinian after Arafat. By killing these men and then suddenly moving out, Israel left an unprepared Palestinian Authority to try and control an angry and isolated population in Gaza who could only watch as Hamas rapidly moved in to fill the void. Unsurprisingly, Hamas's stock, especially among Gazans, was at an all-time high. With no more Israeli presence in the Strip, the stage was set for a showdown between the Palestinian Authority, whose support in Gaza had been waning, and the surging Hamas. When legislative elections were held in 2006, Hamas won a stunning victory. It quickly entered a civil conflict with Fatah, the armed wing of the Palestinian Authority, and without the neutralizing presence of the Israeli military to act as either a common enemy, a mitigator, or even an unwelcome peacekeeper, the isolated Fatah were quickly defeated. As a harbinger of things to come, Hamas paraded captured Fatah militants through the streets of Gaza and quickly doubled down on their dominance in the Strip to become the only political force operating there. By 2007, Gaza Strip was fully under Hamas's control. Prison and release. Throughout all this time, Sinwar remained in prison. By the time Hamas came to dominate the Gaza Strip, Sinwar had served 18 years of his life sentence. During his incarceration, he had remained a domineering presence among Palestinian prisoners, Hamas and Fatah members alike. While in prison, he had also been diagnosed with brain cancer, for which he received surgery in an Israeli hospital and survived. Unfortunately, however, Sinwar's time in prison had not caused him to mellow whatsoever. Moreover, as he would find out, he would not serve out his sentence much longer. In 2011, Benjamin Netanyahu struck a deal with Hamas to release over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in return for captive IDF soldier Gilad Shalit. This deal saw Sinwar's sentence overturned, and he soon arrived back in Gaza a hero, welcomed by adoring crowds amidst a sea of green Hamas flags. As Sinwar himself remarked, this was a starkly different landscape from 1989 when he had been convicted. At that time, Hamas was a little-known Islamist organization advocating regressive and conservative social policies, and whose armed wing had not yet consolidated itself into the notorious Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades. Now, it was a fully armed and well-structured organization with wide support, responsible for running the entire territory of the Gaza Strip. To add to this, the exchange of one Israeli soldier for over 1,000 prisoners represented a massive coup for Hamas, especially in light of the many failed negotiations between Israel and other Palestinian representatives, many of which had ended in frustrating failure. Sinwar was the most highly ranked Hamas member to be released and a top priority for the organization. His return to Gaza was met with a show of strength by Hamas members from the Al-Qassam brigades bedecked in combat uniform. Amidst the throng of Al-Qassam fighters was Sinwar's brother Mohammed, also a highly ranked member of Hamas, and according to Al Jazeera, the man responsible for the detention of Shalit during his lengthy captivity in Gaza. Sinwar had not been inactive during his sentence. For his 22 years behind bars, he had continued to remain actively committed to Palestinian militancy, adopting tools which would further his devotion to the destruction of Israel. He spent his time learning the Hebrew language and studying Israeli culture to better strategize and understand his enemy. By the time he was granted his release, Sinwar had gained fluency in the language and even gave a Hebrew language interview to an Israeli journalist in which he stated dishonestly that he was willing to pursue peaceful resolutions to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. But Sinwar had no intention of a peaceful means to end the conflict. No sooner had he returned to Gaza than he reaffirmed his devotion to Hamas and its violent aims. He quickly rose through its ranks once more, becoming the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 2017. Over the years, Sinwar made ominous statements, which openly displayed his plans for a brutal attack against Israel, speaking of a multitude of people streaming across the border like a flood. This attack, referred to by Hamas as the Al-Aqsa Flood, finally came to be on October 7th, 2023. Preparing for October 7th. Sinwar and Hamas created a vast expanse of tunnel networks under Gaza, both to evade Israeli intelligence and prepare for their ultimate attack. The massive network, dubbed the Gaza Metro, encompassed over 500 kilometers of tunnels by 2021, according to Sinwar himself. In building its tunnel network, Hamas managed to effectively exploit both the limited geographical space of the Gaza Strip and successfully insulate itself against attacks underneath a densely populated urban area, which Israel and Egypt could only target by likely causing significant civilian casualties. According to Reuters, Hamas's tactic also represented a cunning use of the sandy coastal topography of Gaza, which was relatively easy to dig through and which an organization like Hezbollah could not hope to replicate due to the rocky terrain of southern Lebanon. It is these tunnels which have also allowed Hamas to maneuver around the Israeli advantage during the ongoing war. While preparing for the attack, Sinwar made sure to commit acts of violence against Israel, and in 2018 he encouraged Gazans to amass on the border fence with Israel in what became known as the Great March of Return, something which resulted in hundreds of deaths as Israel responded with tear gas and live ammunition. Sinwar did not escape the attention of Israel during this time, which sought to eliminate its sworn enemy outright. Perhaps learning from the Mashal affair, Israel largely abandoned subterfuge-style assassinations and sought to wipe out its targets by airstrikes from a distance. In 2021, one of these strikes was directed at Sinwar, which struck and leveled his house in Gaza. However, the strike didn't kill him, and Sinwar later posed to photos in an armchair in front of the rubble. Pretty savvy PR move. Finally, after years of planning, the Hamas operation was ready to begin. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas's fighters streamed across the frontier and carried out the bloody attack which left over 1,200 Israelis dead and which plunged Gaza into the brutal conflict which continues to engulf it today. Now, if there's one thing that is quite undeniable and certainly not denied by Israel or Hamas, is that Israel wants Yahya Sinwar dead. But despite Israel's advanced military and intelligence capabilities, this is no mean feat. Sinwar is believed to be buried deeply within the Gaza Metro tunnel network and is likely surrounded by the remaining hostages, if not by other civilian targets as well. How long Sinwar can evade capture or elimination is unclear, but it is possible he may not wish to go down without another significant cost to Israeli lives. But the Sinwar experience perhaps also indicates why Israel would, despite the significant pressure exerted upon it to do so, look upon a further prisoner exchange with great hesitance. Remember, it was by virtue of one of these prisoner exchanges that Sinwar was released into the world, the would-be architect of the October 7th attack, seeing liberty despite his multiple life sentences for the murders of 6 people. Although the pressure to secure a ceasefire deal does remain strong, experience no doubt shows that for Israel, the most likely chosen option will be to seek to simply destroy Hamas once and for all, regardless of cost and the resources expended to do it. After all, Hamas has shown time and time again a capacity to regenerate in the wake of losing key leadership. Recall that in 2004, Israel assassinated both founders of Hamas in rapid succession, perhaps thinking that by doing so they were cutting off the head of the snake, which meant the organization would crumble. But that didn't happen, and within 3 years of the deaths of Yassin and al-Rantisi, Hamas had risen to control the Gaza Strip in its entirety. Even if Sinwar's days are numbered, there can be no guarantee for Israel that without wiping out Hamas entirely, that they'll ever be free from the lingering presence of the tormentor. For Sinwar and Hamas, the objective, therefore, shall be to simply hold on as long as possible until Israel buckles from the pressure exerted on it for its brutal bombing of Gaza, or to secure the return of the hostages by a deal. If Hamas can survive the current onslaught or even secure another hostage exchange, this may still be seen as a sort of relative victory in the current context. However, there are signs which would indicate that the decision to carry out the October 7th attack may not have been as well thought out by Sinwar and Hamas as previously thought. For years, Hamas's strength had been to be able to rely on support from the population of Gaza due to its provision of relative normality and everyday services, as well as the high standing of its figureheads and its ability to achieve symbolic victories such as the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange. Yet, the deplorable conditions into which the Palestinians have been thrown due to the conflict sparked by Hamas's attack seem to be beginning to cause this support to backfire. As the war is dragged on with immense cost to Palestinian lives, some in Gaza have begun to openly criticize their leadership for sustaining the ruinous war alongside the widespread destruction carried with it. If public enmity with Hamas rises further, it may cause the unbroken chain of domination by the organization in Gaza to finally topple, something which may be an unexpected yet similarly potent threat to its survival as the ongoing Israeli barrage which targets it. So, if there is one thing that Sinwar and Netanyahu seem to have in common, it's that both are currently facing massive while differing challenges to their political survival, both externally and internally. Amidst this brutal conflict, unfortunately, only time will tell which will give first.